Have you seen the movie Diary of a Wimpy Kid? Don't answer out loud, I won't be able to hear you. But I saw it once. I don't remember everything, but I really liked the way they told the story. It's almost as if the main character is the bad guy, the bad example of what not to do going to middle school. And his friend is the good guy, the example of what you should do. I seem to recall the main character was Greg, that he was being a poor friend to, I think maybe Raleigh, I'm not sure, as they both start middle school. Greg is desperately trying to do anything to become popular, while Raleigh learns the importance of being yourself and forgives Greg for pretty much being a jerk to him. Their two examples seem to be set opposed to each other in contrast to show do this, don't do this. This is one of my favorite ways to tell a story when you see a stark contrast, and this can make a strong point. When I do skits, that's one thing I like to do. One skit of, hey, here's how to welcome a new person. Here's a skit of how not to welcome a new person. When you draw a strong contrast, you can make your point very clearly. And I think this is what Matthew does in Matthew 26, verses 1 through 16, which is what we'll be looking at today. He gives an example of bad guys around an example of good guy to help each example stand out more, contrasting with each other. So, this passage is set right before the Last Supper. We'll be in Matthew 26, verses 1 through 5, if you want to turn there. Okay. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him. But not during the feast, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. Now, if this is sounding really familiar, that's probably because you are watching this after hearing my sermon on Mark 14, which tells the same story. I'm going to look at a few details today that I wasn't able to include in my sermon. Obviously, these leaders are a bad example because they are trying to kill Jesus. One thing Judas had to offer them is something that we would not think about. Throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus warned people over and over not to tell about his identity as the Messiah. But when Jesus is on trial, the religious leaders bring this up. Judas might have helped him with inside information on his claims that Jesus told them not to tell others, in addition to leading them to a good place to arrest Jesus away from the crowds. Going on to verse 6. While Jesus was in Bethany in the home of a man known as Simon the leper. Okay, Bethany is probably where Jesus is spending most of his nights while he's around Jerusalem, since it's only 2 miles outside the city, and the city is currently full of lots and lots of Jews for Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Simon the leper is a man we don't know anything else about besides being mentioned here. It's interesting to note that there is a similar story in Luke 7 where Jesus goes to the house of Simon the Pharisee and a sinful woman anoints Jesus' feet with perfume. That story happens up in Galilee, and Simon's a very common Jewish name, so there are 2 different times that Jesus is anointed. The name is so common it doesn't mean that this is the same place. However, John also includes a story about a woman anointing Jesus in Bethany. But some other details are different, and I want to take a minute to take a look at those because the Bible is not written the way that writers today record history, and just because they do it a different way does not mean that they were idiots or that they got a lot of things wrong. They were just writing for a different audience than us, coming from a different culture, so their expectations were different. In John 12, we are given a lot of names. It says Lazarus, Mary, Martha, but no Simon. Now, critics might just quickly say, see, here's a contradiction in the Bible. It's not true. One says it was Simon, one doesn't. Can't believe the Bible. Okay? However, the critic is not taking time to slow down and think about the possibilities. They have jumped to a conclusion. Well, what do we do when this happens? Personally, when I see an apparent conflict like this, the first thing I do is to remind myself I might not understand everything about how this was recorded and why the author writes the way he does. Second, I read the passage, I read the other related passages, and study commentaries, study Bibles, and other resources to learn more about it because I am not the greatest scholar of biblical times on the planet. There are many people who have gotten doctorates studying these things, and they've thought about my question longer than I have. So one thing I consider in this situation is, hey, this could have happened 2 different times. One time at Simon's house, one time at the house of Lazarus. Something similar already happened in Galilee in the past, and the women may have heard about it and decided to follow that example. I use this approach with a number of Jesus' teachings in different Gospels where a lot of it looks the same and then suddenly a few details are different. For instance, some of Jesus' teaching seems to occur at different times in Matthew than it does in Luke. I wonder at first, okay, why is this? Did they get the time wrong? Then it occurs to me. Jesus taught lots of different crowds. He probably wanted to teach some of the later on people in a different region the same things that he was teaching people earlier on. So he might have said the same things twice. And Matthew decided to record it, the first time he said it. Luke decided to record it the later time he said it. We know the Bible is not trying to record every word he said every time he spoke. So one possibility commentaries suggest here is that John was just recording a different time that this happened from Matthew and Mark. And even though the details that are going to come, so they're going to say she's going to pour the perfume on him, and they respond, well, why wasn't this sold and the money given to the poor? Okay, that's in both accounts, Matthew, Mark, and John. Matthew and Mark are very similar. We're pretty sure that's the same. But in Matthew's and John's, we see that comment. So that's a similarity. But it could have happened 2 different times. Hey, maybe the first time some of the disciples were out having dinner somewhere else. And then they came in the second time and their gut reaction was the same. Oh my goodness, that's so expensive. Why wouldn't you spend it on the poor? So there really could have been the same conversation twice, just with different people. Another possibility is Simon could have been Lazarus' brother. So it was at Simon's house, but Lazarus, Mary, and Martha were all there. Or Simon could have been a family friend and they were all at his house for a big dinner since they had a, kind of important guest. I don't know. Jesus himself was having dinner there. We might want to go visit since he was the one who brought me back from the dead. I think I could spare some time for dinner with him. So they might have been guests there. Now Matthew and Mark do not mention Mary, Martha, or Lazarus in their accounts. And it's important to think about the author. And as a matter of fact, I checked. Matthew and Mark say almost nothing about Mary and Martha throughout their whole gospel. Now John slows down to make a big deal out of them. So maybe in Matthew and Mark's minds, they're like, I don't know if I really want to give this big introduction of these characters. I'm wrapping this up. I'm about to get to the crucifixion. Not going to spend a lot of time on Mary and Martha, so I'll just say, hey, a woman came. Rather than this big introduction. Oh, by the way, Jesus had these other followers, blah, 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 blah. And now the Last Supper, and Jesus is dying. That might have felt out of place for them. So John had already mentioned them. Probably made more sense for him to include the names. So, however, the tough difference between the 2 stories is the timing. So Matthew started by mentioning it is 2 days before the Passover. Mark says it was 2 days and then the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that sounds the same. But, by the way, Passover was kind of the start of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which went on for, I think, a week. but John says it took place 6 days before the Passover. Now, the Greek words used are a little ambiguous. It's like saying in 2 days, but it really could mean on that second day or after that second day had finished. Also, the words are not precise in what they're speaking about. So, is John saying in chapter 12 that 6 days before Passover is when he arrived in Bethany rather than exactly the same day that they had the dinner? It doesn't say he had dinner on the 6th day necessarily. It just kind of flows along. So you assume that, but it's not spelled out. It could just mean he arrived 6 days before Passover, and sometime while he was there, a dinner was held. Also, part of that culture that we don't understand very well is how the Jews reference the festival and the Passover. They could kind of be used interchangeably, the start of the festival or some point during the festival. So to say 6 days before could mean 6 days before the beginning of the festival on Passover, or 6 days from another point of the festival. Now, I mean, if you're like me, in my mind, that should be very clear. It's either the start or you pick another point, but you say, okay, it's before Passover. It should be very clear. But I didn't grow up in their culture, and frankly, I didn't know a whole lot about the Feast of Unleavened Bread before studying this. So that might just be a thing. I just don't know that thing. In some ways, I guess it could be a little like saying, okay, I'll be coming home for Christmas. And then later I tell you, oh, well, I'm coming home on December 22nd. Now, if you fuss at me and said, no, you said you were coming home for Christmas. I was expecting you December 25th. We would be misunderstanding each other because I was meaning, Christmas, the holiday week, that season. But other people might even argue, no, you said Christmas, that's December 24th, Christmas Eve. But as I said earlier, it could also be that this just happened 2 different times on 2 different dates. It seemed like Matthew and Mark are arranging this event so that they can show the contrast and examples. So 2,000 years ago, biographies were not always written strictly in chronological order, first this, then this, then this. In fact, even today's biographies sometimes include a flashback in the middle of a story to explain a detail at the right time. Just because the writers decided to arrange material a certain way to make a point, it doesn't mean they were making errors about the timeline. It's just their way of telling the story in a bit out of order in order to make a point clear. So commentators suggest either explanation is possible. So no, we do not have to throw out the Bible because of something that looked like a contradiction when we first read it. So, our takeaway, we keep an open mind and keep learning about the background of passages when you come across confusing parts of the Bible. Now back to Simon the leper. It's also interesting to think about the home of someone who was known as a leper. What is a leper? Well, a leper is someone with leprosy, a contagious skin disease. And lepers were not allowed inside the city. They had to self-quarantine and practice social distancing. Of course, Jesus had healed several lepers, so Simon probably is a leper that Jesus healed and can live in the city again. Of course, one more possible explanation is that Simon caught leprosy and is letting Lazarus use the house while he was kicked out. So I just want you to know there's several possible explanations, just to keep your mind thinking when you come across something that surprises you. So let's go on to verse 7. A woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." So after this bad example of the religious leaders is the good example of the woman giving her precious, costly perfume to Jesus. And think about this for a minute. The other passages mention that they estimate the cost to be about a year's wages. Okay? Now, I know you guys are not making wages like adults, and it's hard to translate dollars into their money. But let's just say even a low-income job making $20,000 a year. a year's wages. Could you imagine her having $20,000 of perfume lying around? I mean, I'd be thinking, okay, I could pour a little on Jesus and sell the rest for 15,000, There you go. Did something for God, did something for myself. But no, she held nothing back. God sees all she does here. So my question for you is, do you hold back? When you spend time with God, are you rushing to finish and move on to something else? When you help someone else out, do you do the bare minimum to get by? Or do you do your best, even if they won't even notice that you did your best? Hold nothing back from God and from his service and serving others. That's something we can examine ourselves on. Do we hold back? Verses 10 to 11. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." Now, I want to be careful that nobody walks away with this with an attitude of, oh, well, I guess we'll always have the poor, so what difference can I make? I've heard this story where there are a bunch of starfish washed up on the beach, and they're stuck there, and this old man comes around the corner and he sees this little boy picking up starfish and throwing them back in the ocean so that they can live there. And he's like, "You're not going to make any difference. Why are you doing that? There's no point." And the little boy keeps throwing starfish, and he says, "What difference are you making?" And he's like, "Well, I made a difference for that one." He threw another one in. "I made a difference for that one." We're not going to be able to solve everybody's problems, but we can make a difference. Verse 12. "When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." Now, all this talking about aroma and scent reminds me of 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. Kind of a funny passage. Probably not too familiar with it. 2 Corinthians 2, 14 to 16. "But thanks be to God, who always leads us in triumphal procession in Christ, and through us spreads everywhere the fragrance of the knowledge of him. For we are to God the aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one we are the smell of death, to the other the fragrance of life. And who is equal to such a task?" I know some of you are thinking, yeah, I know people who are always the smell of death around everyone. But this passage reminds us that we are going to make an impact on people. Some will be refreshed by us, some will be challenged by us. But we are still the aroma of Christ to both. People react to Christ differently, and they will react to us differently too. God tells us it is not us that they reject, but him. So don't worry that some people won't approve of you being a believer in Jesus. Lots of people didn't approve of Jesus. Stand out for something positive. Going back to Matthew. Wrapping up here, verses 13 to 16. "I tell you the truth, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Matthew gives us the amount of silver. This amount is mentioned in the Old Testament book Zechariah, which is pretty much the only thing I know the book of Zechariah for. Chapter 11, verses 12 to 13, where the money is put in the house of the Lord. And in Matthew 27, 5, the next chapter, Judas throws the money into the temple, just like Zechariah prophesied. Greed is part of Judas's problem. Now, he's been following Jesus for 3 years. We need to be careful to remember that Judas was a human being like us. We need to be careful of any sin that we hold on to without confessing it or challenging it in some way. Any sin that we tolerate can lead us further and further from our Savior till we go way further than we ever meant to go from Him. So that's the last bad example. We looked at the 3 examples: the religious leaders, the woman, and Judas. I encourage you, follow the good example. Devote yourself wholeheartedly to the Lord. Hold nothing back. Love you guys.